We've mentioned by this point that modern Baptists really have more in common with the early Baptists of England than they do with the Anabaptists that we've taken a look at. But how did this come to be? Ultimately, we see that Protestantism, and eventually the Baptist tradition as well, came to England by means of the English Reformation. The English Reformation takes place in 16th century England, when the Church of England broke away from the authority of the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church. These events were in part associated with the wider Reformation. The phases of the English Reformation, which also did cover Wales and Ireland, were largely driven by changes in government policy, to which public opinion gradually accommodated, which, as I've heard one professor lovingly put it, the English Reformation began because Henry VIII got in a tiff with Pope Clement VII about not being able to annul his marriage. And so in a fit of rage, he made his own church. Obviously, it's more complicated than that, but Henry VIII did desire an annulment from his marriage, and at first requested it in 1527 and was denied it. And so from this point, the English Reformation really begins as more of a political affair than a theological dispute. And so the reality of political differences between Rome and England does allow, though, growing theological disputes to come to the forefront. Up until the break with Rome, the Pope and general councils of the church were the ones that decided doctrine. Church law was governed by canon law. All final jurisdiction came from Rome. Church taxes were paid straight to Rome, and the Pope had the final word in the appointment of every bishop in a place that had a Catholic church. The break with Rome was brought about by a series of acts of Parliament passed between 1532 and 1534. Among them, the 1534 Act of Supremacy, which declared that Henry VIII, was, quote, the supreme head on earth of the Church of England. So now final authority in doctrinal and legal disputes now rests firmly in the hands of the monarch. The papacy was deprived of revenue and the final say on the appointment of bishops. But as Henry veers further away from Rome, his loathing of Rome's interference in his affairs would stay with him forever, and it would go on to mark many of his successors as well. The Catholic Church, actually at a certain point in the late 1600s, eventually comes to be banned, and it remains banned and illegal to practice Catholicism until the early 19th century, if you can believe it. The theology and the liturgy of the Church of England becomes markedly more Protestant, somewhat during Henry VIII's reign, but then also especially during the reign of his son, Edward VI, largely along lines laid down by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, but had also served as a diplomat in the various royal courts in Europe, and had come himself to identify with the ideals of the Protestant Reformation. The problem with that, with Edward VI's fervor for Protestantism, was simply that Edward was only 9 years old when he became king. And he was also a sickly child at a point in history when it's not a good idea or not a good thing to be a sickly child. So while he was able to be directed to make England more Protestant, not against his will, but he was directed nonetheless, it wasn't just because Edward was super pious or old and learned and wise. It wasn't anything like that. But he was, though, wise enough to know that he needed to try to rectify the situation with the next in line to the throne, his older sister, Mary. And he tried to have her removed from the line of succession, but ultimately failed. And the reason for this is partly because while Edward and his father Henry were very Protestant, Mary was, to put a title on it, rabidly Catholic. And under Mary, the Protestant Reformation coming to the English shores is reversed and, as much as she could, kicked out of the country. The Church of England is again placed under papal jurisdiction. During her mercifully short 5-year reign, nearly 300 dissenters were burned at the stake during what's called the Marian persecutions. As I said, though, mercifully, she only reigned for 5 years. And her successor was another daughter of Henry, Elizabeth, who we now know as Elizabeth I. During her 44-year rule, Elizabeth I would become the longest reigning monarch in England's history. And she did continue to hold the title until the current Queen Elizabeth, broke the record. And she also became known as the Virgin Queen because she neither married nor bore children. In fact, she was popular to a point where she had a cult of personality, especially around her virgin status. Elizabeth did a lot to reverse the damage that was done by Mary, and she would go further and institute a state church for specifically Protestant England, taking the church that had split from Rome and specifically declaring it a Protestant church. She was also relatively tolerant of dissenters and rarely, though she did, but rarely persecuted dissenting groups. But the number of these dissenters against the church and the crown would go on to grow, partly because of their belief that the Church of England had over-involved itself in government and politics, much like Rome before it, ironically, and partly because of the belief among many of them in the church that the church, though now Protestant, was still getting things wrong on certain issues. And primary among them, there were several primary issues, but primary for our purposes was that of baptism. Many of the dissenters, though they wouldn't call themselves Baptists, they would call themselves separatists or dissenters. Many would become Congregationalists. Some would be called the Puritans. But many of them became convinced of believers' baptism, while the church still practiced infant baptism. And from here we begin to see the first in England of what we would really know as Baptists. Born out of the tradition of the dissenters and of the Puritans after them, they would really come into their own in the 17th and 18th centuries. Their churches would spread across the British Isles, but then also eventually to the New World, as those that we know today as the Pilgrims were in fact separatist Congregationalists who adhered to believers' baptism. Next time we will talk about, in more detail, those English Baptists.